What's your big picture? What's your analysis of that? Where did all the liberals go?
Censorship is a very tempting tactic to embrace for all of us. There's always going to be speech that we think is extremely damaging, that we think is extremely dangerous, that we think is extremely threatening to the things we hold dearest. I mean, in the First Amendment, in the Constitution, when the founders of the United States wrote a constitution, the very first right they identified in the Bill of Rights was the right to free speech and a prohibition on the government infringing it, because history shows that, we're tribal, we're passionate about certain things, especially things that affect us or our tribe or our group. And there's always a very strong temptation that human beings have to want to prohibit certain views, even though they think they're free speech advocates, on the ground that those are just too hateful, too dangerous, too inflammatory. I think that temptation is always there. But I also do think that what has happened in the West over the last, say, 10 to 20 years, and I think Europe's always behind in this regard. Europe has always been more willing to tolerate censorship and more comfortable with quote unquote hate speech laws than the United States. But in the United States as well, which obviously has a big influence on the West, there has been implanted this framework that ideas that are hateful, ideas that might incite anger or attack or violence against vulnerable minority groups can be censored. And now, in the last, say, 7 years, I think really since Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump in 2016, you have this added notion that quote-unquote disinformation is so dangerous that you need the government to step in or big tech companies to step in and prohibit that as well. And there's a kind of censorship now that is tolerated. I don't think one of the very first things the EU did after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was enact a law making it illegal to any platform to allow RT or Sputnik or other Russian state media to be heard. So if you're an adult European citizen and you want to hear what the Russians are saying, the EU has made it extremely difficult for you to be able to access that because it's illegal to platform those media outlets so you can't hear the other side. That to me is shocking, but it didn't make very many waves. I think, we're seeing now laws being enacted in the Congress that adopt this broadened definition of anti-Semitism that includes things like comparing the actions of the Israeli state to Nazism, or claiming that certain Jewish individuals have a greater loyalty to Israel than they do to the United States, or even saying that you think Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. Ideas that have been around for a long time that people believe in, that are not violent, that are prohibited under this expanded definition. It's just this creeping, once you enact the mentality that certain ideas are so hateful that they can be banned, every group is going to want to kind of grab some of that for their own benefit.
Why do you think it's happening now, though? That's the question. I would agree. It's definitely happening. Canada, the US, and indeed it's definitely in Europe as well. There is less and less tolerance for hearing uncomfortable things that advantage your opponents. And both sides are guilty of this, I feel like. But why now? What is it, big picture, it feels definitely like 30, 40 years ago, there was a much higher degree of confidence that society would survive, even if there were some nasty opinions floating around. But that's gone.
Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit careful about romanticizing the past. There have been a ton of censorship, moral panics, at least in the United States. For a long time, people who were assumed to be communists weren't allowed to practice law. They weren't allowed to be heard in certain cases. A lot of the most important free speech precedents in the United States are restricting or limiting the ability to, say, punish communists for their ideology. There were a lot of various acts immediately after the founding, and then in World War I, Woodrow Wilson succeeded in enacting this Espionage Act of 1917, which is still the kind of thing that's used to prosecute people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, and even Donald Trump, that was designed to criminalize dissent to U.S. involvement in World War I, and it ended up imprisoning people like Union Devs. So there's been we don't want to kind of create this ideal past, but I agree with you, it has gotten more intense, more kind of widely accepted, and I think, and it's a lot of reasons, but I think it's very cultural that there has been this idea that people have the right now to feel comfortable at all times, never to feel like they're being confronted with ideas that make them uncomfortable or feel unsafe, that's now the highest value. And it's kind of, I think, starting with the millennial generation, and certainly even more so with Gen Z, that once you go to college, you're not even an adult. You still have to be protected almost like a child. So the college administrators and deans replace your parents. And then it's even now extended into the workplace, where people go to work and they also anticipate or expect to be protected from ideas that make them uncomfortable. And the HR department is what replaces the college dean, which in turn replaces the parent. So I think there has been bred in the book, Coddling the American Mind is probably the best that traces this devolution, that there's this expectation that people have the right to be protected, not just from violent attacks, but from words. And it kind of, transformed from childhood, where arguably it belongs, into early adulthood at college, where it doesn't, and then now into the workplace, where it most definitely doesn't. And now it's just this generalized expectation that value, feeling comfortable, never feeling challenged, never feeling like you're exposed to ideas that make you unsafe, is a higher value than free speech itself. And once that tipping point was reached, it was kind of just the floodgates were open.
The other new thing is that there is now the mechanism through the internet, through these vast technology companies, to actually control a narrative in a way that was not possible 40 years ago. And we've got caught up in that recently with being put on a blacklist by a strange organization called the Global Disinformation Index that we'd never even heard of, somewhere deep in the bowels of the internet, which controls, acts like a gatekeeper for online ad systems. And I feel like the complexity of the online world and the oligopoly of the companies that control it, is like the perfect censors environment.
What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? If you're checking your phone, stop that. Instead, try this technique.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important developments in the last decade in the West, especially for the cause of a free internet, which was also the cause when I did the Snowden reporting, keep the internet free of government surveillance, otherwise it loses its value, and now keep it free of censorship for the same reason. If you can actually trace the advent of this new quote unquote disinformation industry. I mean, the whole idea of a disinformation expert is a completely fabricated credential. It's a fabricated expertise. There's nobody as kind of a generalized means more competent to identify disinformation than other people. Obviously, in specialized areas, you would trust a surgeon more than a lay person to debate medical issues, or a trained pilot more than a lay person to debate aviation issues. But there's no such thing as a person who is just kind of like a free-floating arbiter who's more able to decree truth than other people. It's a completely invented and concocted expertise that's designed to make political censorship have the prettified appearance of being something neutral, apolitical, and scientific. And the whole industry is completely new. It immediately emerged right after 2016, where, as I said, the dual events, the dual traumas to Western liberalism of Brexit, followed by Donald Trump's victory of Hillary Clinton, made Western elites conclude that they could no longer trust a free internet. They could no longer allow free speech to be unconstrained and out of their control, because when it is, they can no longer control the behavior of the citizenry. So they go and vote for Brexit, they elect Donald Trump, they make bad decisions. And one of the means, because of course they couldn't admit they were engaged in political censorship on the internet, to do so is it popped up all these disinformation groups with very banal and kind of neutral sounding names, including the one you just mentioned. And if you look at who funds them, it's always the same small group of people. It's either a handful of neoliberal billionaires like Pierre Omidyar or Bill Gates or George Soros. It's not conspiratorial. It's just that's who really funds them. Or the U.S. security state, or even British intelligence and EU security agencies, or big tech that says this is going to be our arbiter. They all have the same ideology. It's entirely designed to take anti-establishment views and label them disinformation as a means for a justification for banning them or for limiting their spread, when in reality, I think you can obviously make the case that the most amount of quote-unquote disinformation comes from the very large establishment factions, including corporate media, that is purporting to combat disinformation through these kind of tools. And that, to me, is the most dangerous development, at least as far as the free internet is concerned.
Here's what we've come up against, that I've been making a lot of noise about this, and the fact that it's received government money is something that I can very legitimately claim and complain about. We've got a response from the government, at least in the UK, saying they will not fund it anymore. I count that as a small victory. There are other governments still funding them. But actually, even if you had no government funding, these things would still exist. And where I almost despair, I don't know what your thoughts would be, is it actually ultimately comes from corporations. The incentive to stay what they would consider safe, to put their advertising dollars next to kind of approved narratives and to live in a less controversial, less competitive world, seems to be very attractive to big corporations, which ultimately pay for everything. So I've sort of run out of road here on this complaint.
The whole point of the Enlightenment, which gave rise to all sorts of institutions that we still cherish today, including the American founding, but all sorts of others, was that we never trust centralized large institutions any longer to dictate to us what is true and what is false, whether it be monarchs or the church or any other, that we have the right as individuals to engage in free and open discourse, to use our capacity for reason to decide for ourselves what we believe. That is really what's at stake. Of course, when you have the power to control the flow of information, when you have the power to determine what people in a large country can hear and what they cannot hear, you control their thought and therefore their behavior, and how power is dispersed is incredibly valuable power that, of course, power centers are going to try to recoup for themselves. They lost it through the internet, and they're now trying to degrade the internet into that model where they, again, giant corporations, working hand in hand with governments, try and control the kinds of ideas that can be expressed and the kinds of ideas that can be heard. That's an incredible power. Of course, no establishment sector is going to lose that power without a fight. That's why, to me, this kind of struggle, this battle to preserve internet freedom is of the highest priority for me. And I cherish most of the spaces, the platforms, the companies that are truly devoted to resisting the censorship framework because of how tyrannical it is. I mean, I know we don't like to use the word tyranny for our own countries in the West, but that's what it is. It's authoritarian and tyrannical to have these institutions, corporate or governmental, empowered to dictate what is truth and what is falsity. It's obviously what Orwell warned about with the Ministry of Truth, or just in general to be able to control the list of ideas that are permitted and the ones that aren't.
And do you feel in any way optimistic? You mentioned some channels coming up, but perhaps you would include ours and your own, and there are others which are growing and have some influence, albeit small compared to the corporate media, that are at least trying to be more independent. I also observe a kind of slightly negative trend among some of those anti-establishment voices, that they themselves have their own pathologies and strange behaviors. They form their own cliques and groups. They tend to get more and more reactionary as a trend, I would say, until they're kind of self-reinforcing, and they're another herd, they're another power center. Do you despair even about the anti-establishment media?
I agree with your critique of independent media completely. There's also the big problem of audience capture, that if you're not relying on corporate advertisers or, financing by billionaires, which are alternative ways, you rely on your audience, then there's a strong temptation never to tell them what they don't want to hear because of fear of losing their financial support. These are all terrible incentives. But any institution, any subculture constructed by human beings, by definition, is going to be imperfect. It's going to be corrupted. It's going to have flaws. I think the most important thing is to have a multiplicity of them. So even if, there's people over there in that corner challenging establishment dogma because they make a lot of money off of it, or they're getting a lot of it, they have corrupt motives, bad motives, self-interested motives, it's still the more diversity of views that are permitted to flow, the less constraints there are on ideas that can flow, the better. And it may be the case that there are a bunch of different power centers that have bad motives among them, but it's still better than having everything homogenized into one set of opinions controlled by a centralized source.
Okay, final question for you. I know you have to go. If there is a role for government, let's say right now, for example, since the little experience we've had here in the UK, there's a lot of people inside government who are looking for ideas. They genuinely are not happy about what happened to us. They want to know, hey, what should we do? And I don't have a long list of ideas. I mean, is there any role for government to actually try to retain that multiplicity? In other words, instead of working hand in glove with big tech and with corporations, they should actually be trying to break them up, trying to, observe the tendency towards bigness. What would you like to see governments do that they're not?
Yeah, I think the first thing governments need to do is keep their hands off the internet. We've seen in your country, this Online Safety Act, in the EU, the Digital Services Act, there's terrible laws pending in Canada and Brazil. And we've seen the Biden administration pressuring big tech companies to censor. So the first step is keep the government out of the business of trying to control the flow of information. But then you have the secondary problem, as you alluded to, that these giant corporations can also do that because they're the ones who control these platforms. And I think part of the responsibility of government, I very much believe, is to prevent monopolies from emerging. So if there's too much power concentrated in too few hands, that level of financial and economic inequality, observe the American founders and many other people, will translate into political inequality by definition, a kind of tyranny that comes from this massive wealth. It's not a communist idea. It's not saying we need socialism. It's saying that part of the duty of government is to prevent monopolistic power. And I think I'm very much behind these efforts in the EU, increasingly in the United States, to break up Google, to break up Facebook, to break up Amazon and Apple in order to make the market more competitive and ensure a competition of views and ideas and other emerging platforms, because they have too much power centralized in the hands of a tiny few corporate actors.
Could they even make it the law that if there were big quasi-monopolies like YouTube or Google, that if they did any censorship, they would have to have a transparent mechanism, they'd have to tell people about it, offer an appeal, etc.? I mean, would you be in favor of that? Government kind of stepping into these organizations and legislating?
Or just banning it all. I mean, if you look at, say, the telephone company, which is treated as a utility because of, at least in the United States, and I'm not sure in Europe, you could never have, for example, AT&T say, oh, this person has radical ideas that we don't want to be associated with, so that we're going to deny them telephone service. Nobody holds the telephone company responsible for radicals who organize bad ideas or even crimes over the telephone. The idea is this is a public service available for everybody. We're seeing the exclusion of people based on their political views from the financial services industry, being banned from PayPal, excluded from banks, having their bank accounts closed, or not being able to open ones. I think the government does have a role in preserving the openness of these kinds of services and prohibiting people from being discriminated against based on their political ideology.
Glenn, as always, lots of really interesting, challenging ideas. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, always happy to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
That was Glen Greenwald talking to us from